everyone. So next week is the Day of Atonement, and so that's what my topic is on today. Although I should say it's on a really one very, very small aspect of the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is just rich with symbology. It may be the most symbolically rich of any of the holy days. I don't know, but it's got a lot going on. So I'm just going to focus on one small part of it. And so the thought is that the Day of Atonement is the day that the sanctuary itself was cleansed. And so I came across this thought while I was reading a book by Dr. Sam Bakioki. And so taking Neil's precaution to heart about not depending too much on commentary, I am cross-checking everything he says that I'm presenting today against the Bible. And some of it I am leaving out because I don't think the evidence is quite strong enough to include. But so I'm going to, so the point, or one of the points, it's a lot of points he makes in the book, but this one small point is he says, the sanctuary was defiled through symbolic transfer of atoned sins into the holy place. And he says sins were kept in the sanctuary until their removal on the Day of Atonement, which was the annual day of cleansing of the sanctuary from the accumulated sins of Israel. So I don't know if all of that sentence has got a lot of strong backing, but some of it for sure does. And so I was going to go over, go over some of it. So the first point in that declaration that I feel is really strongly supported is that the sanctuary itself was cleansed on the Day of Atonement. And so I will start here in Leviticus 16, which probably all of us know is all about the Day of Atonement. So I don't have to go over the part where it says this is the Day of Atonement. Hopefully y'all grant that. But so down in verse 15, it says, "Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people, bring its blood inside the veil." That's important, inside the veil, "and sprinkle it on the mercy seat before the mercy seat. So he shall," and talking about the priest here, of course, "he shall make atonement for the holy place." So right there, to me, that's strong evidence that the Holy of Holies itself, and I guess by extension the whole sanctuary, is being atoned for by that act of going inside the veil and sprinkling the blood. Anyway, it says, "because of the uncleanliness of the children of Israel, because of their transgressions, for all their sins, and so he shall do for the tabernacle of meeting, which remains among them in the midst of their uncleanness." And so I'll add verse 17, which shows that the holy place was just one of the things cleansed on that day. And then it says, "There shall be no man in the tabernacle of meeting when he goes in to make atonement in the holy place, until he comes out, that he may make atonement for himself, for his household, and for all of the assembly of Israel." So it was a general atonement, but it was also specifically, and as we'll show, only on this day, that the Holy of Holies itself was purified, cleansed. There's a number of words that she's for, atoned for. And then that thought is reiterated at the end of the chapter in like a little summary section, verse 32. "And the priest who is anointed and consecrated to minister as priest in his father's place shall make atonement for the holy sanctuary, and make atonement for the tabernacle of meeting, and for the altar, for the priest, and for all the people of the assembly." Well, that's not a very controversial statement that the Holy of Holies itself was being atoned for on the Day of Atonement. The context of Hebrews 9 is also the Day of Atonement. So this is Hebrews 9, verse 19. And if you're trying to follow along, I do skip, without telling you I'm skipping, I'll skip a verse or half a verse or something. And whenever I do that, it's never to try to obscure the meaning, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not focusing on the part I'm wanting to. It's just giving some side information. So anyway, I'm skipping 19 to 22 here. But it says, or 21. So Moses sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things were purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. Okay, that's setting the background. Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things in heaven, so that's talking about the Holy of Holies, the mercy seat, all that stuff, is the copies of the things in heaven, should be purified with these. But the heavenly things themselves were better sacrifices than these. So the actual throne of God will be purified with better sacrifices, obviously referring to Jesus. And then it says, for Christ has not entered the holy place made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into the heaven itself, to appear before God. Not that he should offer himself often, as the priests do in the most holy place every year, with the blood of another, meaning blood of goats and stuff. Bulls and goats. So to contrast that yearly sacrifice specific to the Day of Atonement, Dr. Sam makes this statement that the daily sacrifices were never mentioned to be for the sanctuary. Now, verifying a never statement is really difficult because it means I'd have to read every word or, search. It'd be a little tough to search for that. Although I am inclined to believe it, and I didn't find any counterexamples, but I did find easy to find examples of where the daily sacrifice was for the individuals or individual making the sacrifice. And so I'll just go over a couple of those. I doubt that's anything will have any controversy over that, but just in Leviticus 4, verse 13, it says, now if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, so it's the whole congregation, sins unintentionally, the priest performs some sacrificial, that's just my paraphrase. It describes a bunch of stuff the priest does, like ritual stuff. And verse 20, so the priest shall make atonement for them, and it shall be forgiven them. It is a sin offering for the assembly. So that was for the whole assembly. Well, it repeats that basic pattern in verse 22, and it says, when a ruler has sinned unintentionally, so the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin, and it shall be forgiven him. And then in verse 27, it repeats again. It says, if any of the common people sin unintentionally, concluding with verse 31, so the priest shall make atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven for him. Seems fairly inclusive. And this is just a real side thing. When it says unintentionally, I don't know that means exactly like it was an accident. Maybe it's one of those, I don't know, you're doing it, but you're not like premeditated sin, right? So I don't know if it's exactly unintentional that, I didn't even know I sinned, kind of a thing. But anyway, I don't know. That's off the point. But anyway, well, it's not completely off the point, but because unintentional, there is a difference between what they classify as unintentional sins and deliberate, premeditated. If the sanctuary needed cleaning, so if the sanctuary needed cleansing, or I don't know about needed, but I'm assuming it needed it, because it was cleansed and or purified, the question kind of comes up naturally, well, why? Or how did it get defiled in the first place? And the short answer is sins of the people. And now, Dr. Bakioki talks kind of at length about how he feels that happened. And I didn't include any of that because that was in some of the part I thought was a little bit too much deduction and not enough actual verses. But anyway, I think it's pretty, I'll be able to show pretty easily that it was the sins of the people that contaminated the Holy of Holies. Well, not just the Holy of Holies, but the whole complex of the sanctuary. So this is Exodus 23, verse 36. It says, Son of man, will you judge Ulah and Olebah? And that means Israel and Judah. Will you judge them? Then declare to them their abominations. They have committed adultery with their idols, and even sacrificed their sons, passing them through the fire. They have defiled my sanctuary on the same day and profaned my Sabbaths. For after they had slain their children for their idols, on the same day they came to the sanctuary to profane it. And thus indeed they have done in the midst of my house. So when I hear the word defile the sanctuary, my first thought is that some sin or insult was performed inside that area. But here is an example of where that isn't necessarily so. Like, for example, the example I have written here is in history, vindictive Gentiles would bring pig's blood or sacrifice a pig in the temple to show how much disdain they have for the God of Israel. Well, that obviously is profaning, defiling the sanctuary. But in this verse, the sin was for sure committed outside the sanctuary because it says they went and came in there later that day. So they were outside the area, probably hidden because they don't necessarily want to advertise their pagan sacrifices. But then they come and go into the sanctuary. And to me, it appears that the sins are kind of like piggybacking on the sinner when he walks into the sanctuary. Now, that's just my thoughts on it. It doesn't exactly say how that contaminated sanctuary. It just says it was defiled. And then, so for another apparent piggyback verse is number 19. And the verse I've got, can't read it too easily, but it might be 13, might be 15. Whoever touches the body of anyone who has died and does not purify himself defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. To me, the implication is that he defiles it, or she, when they come into the tabernacle. It doesn't exactly say that, but when you first touch it, it's not saying it defiled it because you have a bit of time to go do the ritual cleansing. So to me, that's the implication is before you do that, you went to the tabernacle, kind of a piggyback arrangement. Leviticus 22 is a little bit different. So it says, whoever of the children of Israel or of the strangers who dwell in Israel, so this is the strangers, and I don't know for sure, but anyway, who gives any of his descendants to Molech, he shall surely be put to death. I will set my face against that man and cut him off from his people, because he gave some of his descendants to Molech, to defile my sanctuary and profane my holy name. So, although this verse isn't conclusive, it makes it seem like the sins defile the sanctuary even if they didn't go there, like before they even go there. And that's what Dr. Sam believes, that the sins are transferred through other methods.
obviously he sees where the actual committing of the sin in the sanctuary, also another way it happens. But anyway, I'm not 100% convinced on how it happens, but it for sure happens. I think that's no doubt. So now here's some later verses when Israel had a temple, and to me it shows that these show there's kind of a continuity between the tabernacle that they had in Moses' time with the temple they had later. So in 2 Chronicles 36, it says Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. And it says he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Moreover, all the leaders of the priests and people transgressed more and more according to the abominations of the nations, and defiled the house of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. It doesn't say these abominations were created in the temple complex, but maybe they were. But I think so it's possible that just committing these abominations in the land of Israel contaminated, or perhaps it was they did some of it on the temple complex, not sure. Jeremiah 7, for the children of Judah have done evil in my sight. They have set their abominations in the house which is called my name to pollute it. So there's an example of they probably were making inappropriate sacrifices in the temple, something like that. And then Zephaniah 3, and this is a passage against Jerusalem. It says, her prophets are insolent, treacherous people. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. So I think we see that the sanctuary could get defiled, how it does. The Bible says it a number of times. And that the Day of Atonement appears to be when it is cleansed of those, with the appropriate sacrifices and stuff. Now, for a little bit of a side point, some sins, atonement could be made through a sacrifice or something like that. However, some sins could only be atoned for through punishment, like a separate sacrifice, and wasn't good enough, and the law didn't allow for that. And I'll give a couple examples. So 1 Samuel 3, verse 11. This is something God's telling Samuel in a dream or vision or whatever. I have told him, and that's speaking of Eli, that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity of his, which he knows about, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. And therefore I have sworn that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for sacrifice or offering forever. And I think what that means is, okay, Eli's being punished, can't be a priest anymore forever and ever. No possibility of sacrifice covering it. Numbers 35, back in the law, it's verse 31 saying, moreover, you shall take no ransom, in other words, no sacrifice or payment, for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And you shall take no ransom for him who fled the city to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest. So you shall not pollute the land where you are, for the blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed on it. So, in other words, no atonement can be made except by the blood of him who shed it. So a murderer must pay with his own life, according to the law. So the main point of my talk today that I hadn't really consciously thought about was that the sanctuary itself would get defiled and was purified on the Day of Atonement. And for all the liturgy around Day of Atonement, that does seem like an important detail. And I think it's worth considering that if, ask ourselves, does that detail have any relevance to the days of, the events that happen in Revelation, or fulfillment there? So a fancier theological way to ask the same question is, does that have a prophetic antitype? And so I'll just throw out one obvious possibility, is that maybe that cleansing of the temple is symbolic. So, the sins have been forgiven already, but then they're cleansed from the temple. Is that symbolic of maybe when the very final disposition of sin, maybe, or when all the sins are maybe even just forgotten at that point? So there'll be no remembrance. Maybe the books are wiped clean. I don't know. That's just some thoughts of maybe what it might symbolize. And so for one last bit of conjecture, so those interpretations, that's just me, right? I'm not saying make that an extra chapter in the Bible. But so this conjecture is based on 3 points. Now the 3 points are pretty solid, but the conjecture is maybe not. So the sanctuary, and presumably the temple later in Israel's history, was cleansed once a year on the Day of Atonement. Point 2 is the only day of the year that we are commanded to fast is the Day of Atonement. The New Testament tells us that our bodies, we are the temple of God because the Holy Spirit lives here now. So we are literally the temple, spread out, but we're the temple. So maybe the fasting on the Day of Atonement is kind of a type or symbolic of the cleansing of that temple. Anyway, y'all have a good day.